As above, so below.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist. I do psychotherapy, and I'm very interested in the relationship between synchronicity and interpersonal as well as intrapsychic relations. I have a new book, Meaningful Coincidences, which you can get at any bookstore or online. And it'll tell you about serendipity, synchronicity, as well as simulpathity, and a word I invented, and seriality, 4 forms of meaningful coincidences. But my story for today is down by the river and a little Grateful Dead thrown in. A friend of a good friend of mine has spastic cerebral palsy. I wondered if a good chiropractor could loosen him up, but that seemed unlikely. Then a few days later, as I was thinking about this, I was walking along the Ravenna River here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I saw 5 guys sitting on some rocks along the river. 4 of them were listening to the 5th song, to the 5th talk. So I said something to them that reminded me that what they were doing reminded me of a Grateful Dead song. And what song was that, they asked. So I sang a line from Uncle John's band. Come here, Uncle John's band, by the riverside. Got some things to talk about. And they were doing some talking about. So they invited me down after they started laughing. And the speaker turned out to be a body worker who was looking for someone with severe spastic cerebral palsy to work on. He's had some success with mild spastic cerebral palsy and wanted to try more difficult challenges. My good friend was delighted to hear this possibility and to bring it to her friends. Sometimes what you are looking for, what you are seeking, is also looking for you. My guest today is Rick Tarnas, and so glad to see him again. He's a professor of philosophy and psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where he founded the graduate program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He teaches courses in the history of ideas, archetypal cosmology, depth psychology, and religious evolution. He's the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a big enough book, but as he was doing it because he wanted to write another book, Cosmos and Psyche, about astrological correlations with history, but he realized he had to do history first. So he wrote this Passion of the Western Mind, another amazing tome, and then Cosmos and Psyche, which, as I say, connects what's going on down here with what's going on astrologically at historical levels. Cosmos and Psyche received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network and inspired the documentary series, The Changing of the Gods. It's based on this book. So, Rick, thank you very, very much for joining me on the show. And please tell us one of your favorite synchronicity stories.
Well, first, it's good to see you again, Bernie. I think this is about the 3rd time that we've done something together over the years. And yes, I remember when we first met, it was pretty soon after Cosmos and Psyche came out, and because you were coming back into back to San Francisco for a visit, and where you had been for years, and where I live in the Bay Area, we got together. And I think, yeah, I remember at that time feeling a real, well, at that point, there weren't that many MDs and PhDs that were publicly engaged with the study of synchronicities in whatever form. And so I was heartened by that, and of course we had lots of common interests and background and so forth, and so I've enjoyed our friendship over the years, and also appreciated your your work in this area, particularly bringing into psychiatry and psychotherapy the importance of, I mean, you've extended beyond that now, but to the degree to which you, I mean, devoted a whole issue or two of your journal that you were editing at that point to the relevance of synchronicity for supporting the therapeutic process and informing it, illuminating it, etc. My wife Yvonne did her dissertation on that topic from particularly within the Jungian analytical perspective, and so it's an area of real importance. And I might just add, this might be, I suppose, my entree into a synchronicity story. Really, it may seem odd for a person who, you know, is a professor of philosophy and history to also be writing books about or even teaching courses that involve any form of evidence or assumptions about the fact that the movements of the planets might have some meaningful correlation with the patterns of human experience. I mean, that's almost like a self-contradiction. How is that possible if you're a person who is, you know, a modern academic? Astrology is the gold standard of superstition in our culture, and it's one thing to look at synchronicities, which is already getting a little bit fuzzy and magical thinking, delusions of self-reference, perhaps, even though some of those coincidences to even the most skeptical person make them go, wow, that's quite a coincidence, and they may have to go through some emotional denial to keep it at a distance. But still, synchronicity is a little bit more acceptably on the borderline of what could be encompassed by our modern or postmodern intellectuals. And in fact, I have a friend who is a professor of religious studies, quite a famous author as well as and scholar in this area. And like many professors of religious studies, he's quite skeptical about a lot of aspects of religion. But he said to me once, I don't believe in anything anymore, except I do believe in synchronicity. And I think of that as being a kind of paradigm statement of a postmodern sensibility where the old, in some sense, the old gods have fallen, the stars have fallen from the heavens, as Jung put it. We seem to live in a universe described by modern science as being disenchanted and so forth, and yet these meaningful synchronicities happen to most of us, perhaps all of us, some of overwhelming personal impact.
Yeah.
And within that very personal sphere of life, we open up to the possibility that there may be something more, like capital S, capital M, something more in the nature of reality. And that something more is, of course, William James's term. And so in some ways, I think your work with synchronicity and our common interest in it and writing about it has to do, reflects our recognition that synchronicity is a kind of entree into a larger recognition of the world as being spiritually, meaningfully informed, that more is going on than just a disenchanted, mechanistic worldview can accommodate. Shakespeare's great line about there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. from Hamlet. That's the nub of it. There's more things than any philosophy can encompass, and synchronicities constantly puncture that conviction that maybe our modern disenchanted rationalist understanding has nailed it, the nature of reality, when in fact it's only got a thin and superficial slice of the big picture.
What
Okay,
is it?
so
What does it mean to you that there have been there's an article about my book and meaningful coincidences in both the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times?
and you want to just give a sentence characterization of the reviews?
The Wall Street Journal was more focused on meaningful coincidences and coincidences that readers had sent in to the writer. With my book being a central part of it and my quotes being a central part of it. But the LA Times one was all about my book with people kind of reacting to it and ending with, in both cases, stories by the reporter of their own meaningful coincidences. And the LA one got a lot of response from what I could tell from Amazon book sales, and the Wall Street Journal to some extent. So that seems to me a step in the direction that both of us want to have happen, that it becomes like that philosopher friend of yours who's saying, well, maybe there is something to synchronicity.
Yeah, I think it reflects these are signs of an emerging shift in the zeitgeist, in the cultural worldview. Part of that shift, I think, is reflected in generational changes. If I can generalize, I mean, you and I are from the boomer generation, and honestly, in the 1960s, much of the 70s, I would say something like synchronicity was just part of the fabric of reality for many people who were involved in the counterculture, which was an enormous percentage then, before everybody went to Wall Street or other. I mean,
or law school, yeah.
yeah.
Or open up shops on Union Street. That was one of my favorites.
So, I mean, there's many ways in which people settled down or went straight or whatever, but I think the ideal was to somehow find a way of simultaneously making a living, being able to raise a family or whatever was one's path, and at the same time hold true to the insights and the ideals that emerged during that period of kind of cultural and even spiritual creativity that was taking place, partly mediated by the psychedelic revolution, that opened up people's minds to the possibility that there was a much larger and more interesting and enchanted reality that was being obscured or blocked by the narrow form of the filtering of our modern perception and thinking. So I was just saying, we come from that boomer generation that did carry a lot of this, and a number of people, and you were certainly one of them, stayed true to those insights at the same time that you went on to get an MD and become a practicing physician, psychiatrist, and so forth. But I think generationally, each generation since then, and particularly I think the millennial generation, born in the later 80s and 90s, it's almost as if there's been a kind of dissolving of the epistemological armoring that earlier generations carry. By that I mean there's a earlier generations in the modern period have had more of a rigid sense of what's allowed into their view of reality, and millennials, for example, the tremendous popularity of astrology among millennials that's been written about in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so forth, that that's pointing to, I think, this greater metaphysical flexibility, this greater openness to multiple realities being valid. So synchronicities coming, I mean, you know, I attended and spoke at an entire large conference devoted to synchronicity about 10 years ago, that was put on. Number of scholars were there and so forth. I think synchronicity is a good opening wedge to help us recognize that. I think I suggested as the title for today's conversation could be "All Things Breathe Together," and that points to an understanding of the way synchronicities work is the fact that reality itself is all intrinsically interconnected. It's an interconnected whole in some way, and it is meaningful through and through. And meaning is not just a human construct. It's something that nature, the cosmos, the very nature of reality is meaning saturated, and human consciousness is participating in that larger meaning saturated field. And so when synchronicities take place, those reflect this larger coherence, this larger meaningful patterning of reality. I might mention that it's only in the modern period that a word like synchronicity that Jung, C.G. Jung, coined. It's only in this modern period that that the phenomenon of synchronicity would even have to be talked about as a particular thing, because all non-modern societies already live in such a synchronistic universe that they don't need a term for it. When a person who I give an example in my book of like when a baby is born in a tribal indigenous culture, and at the same time that the baby's born, two eagles are seen as flying overhead, and that's seen as meaningful, that this birth and those eagles flying overhead happen at the same time. The disenchanted modern mind would say, well, that's just a projection. It's just a coincidence. The meaningful thing is this birth is happening to this person. The eagles have nothing to do with the baby being born. And but for this non-modern sensibility, that's just a kind of opacity. There's a kind of obtuse blindness that the modern mind has, like, because it just recognized everything's breathing together, and this baby being born and those two eagles going overhead, that's a signal. That's the universe is full of signs. Nature is constantly communicating it's the meaning of the whole situation to the part that is our consciousness, and if we in our deluded way think that we're the only sources of meaning, then we're locked into a prison compared to those peoples who get to experience being in a world in which the world communicates meaningfully all the time to the human being, because the human being doesn't look at itself as being the exclusive owner of all capacity for meaning and purposeful intelligence.
That's beautifully said, Rick. And I actually needed to hear that myself, because I've gotten more and more, the meaning is what I put into it kind of way of thinking, and even what's out there, I put meaning into it. And the idea that nature is meaningfully communicating to us, I mean, I kind of know that from a bunch of experiences, but I needed the label of it, which is why academics like us are important, because we can label things that people then can say, they can recognize it. Now, why is nature communicating meaningfully to us?
That's a great point. And I think it has something to do with, I mean, again, you think of a tribal culture, whether 5,000 years ago or continuing to this day, many of them carry this enchanted recognition of the soul of the world that they are participating in. We're a member of a community as human beings, a larger community of many species, many forms of life, even many forms of being, the water, the air, the wind, the trees, and the animals and fish and so forth. And we are not seen as being, kind of this absolutely different, distinct, separate organism that has its own rules, and everything else is devoid of these privileged capacities that we have. Rather, we are participating in this worldview that's pretty much shared among most societies that we have records for going back thousands of years. The human being and that tribe living on that land experiences itself as being a member of a larger, basically a linguistic community that is this community of other beings, whether it's trees or birds or the wind, being part of the whole that we are part of. It communicates symbolically, and indigenous people and poets, good poets of any era, they get good at being able to discern the poetic. They cultivate a capacity for symbolic discernment, because the world is pregnant with meaning and purposes, and it's constantly communicating its own reality to the rest of the whole. And if we can be alert to this meaningful exchange, it's an archetypal language. It's a language that uses symbols and archetypes to communicate meaning. And other cultures were very sophisticated in being able to read the whole, whether it was reading the stars or reading the patterns of the bird flights or the wind, and then patterning their own activity in relationship to the signals that they were getting from the whole. We today are having to kind of relearn, cultivate that capacity for discernment in order to break out of the bubble of an anthropocentric claim
prison.
that only we are meaningful.
Prison. It's that we're locked in it, and we know we have to do something different now. We know we have to do something different now. And this is really love listening to your description. You're such a scholar and teacher. I've been able to hear one like that for quite a while. So hearing you wax eloquent about synchronicity, it will be very valuable for our audience, because they can hear the concepts that you have visualized so nicely. What we are trashing our planet right now. We are ignoring the trees and the birds and the other animals, as well as the fungi that are around there, but we're ignoring them because we're the only ones here, is the basic idea. And that is ending up being a suicidal thing for humanity to be doing this, as well as we're killing so many animals and plants too. How can this recognition of we are part of this whole, and parts of that whole are communicating to us, how can that recognition help, if we want to, and we have to decide, there is some free will here, how can synchronicity help us change our course and become more aware and actively changing our relationship to what's around us?
Yeah, this is $1 million question, because, or trillion, because obviously we're at a kind of apocalyptic threshold. The planet is going through a mega crisis that one species has produced, and not only one species, but one civilization within that species, modern industrial civilization, empowered by technology, empowered by this tremendous development of human rationality, but all within the service of a kind of objectification of a world that should more accurately be regarded not as a collection of objects, as Thomas Berry would say, but as a communion of subjects. And once synchronicities help us recognize that we live in a world that is a communion of subjects that all have that are all participating in a larger circulation of meanings and purposes. But because of the anthropocentric arrogance of the mainstream modern self as embodied in industrial civilizations, extraction of everything that it can get out of nature, with no sense of our being embedded in it, and now what it's doing to us. We're going through a kind of classic Greek tragedy of hubris and fall, in which the hubris came from basically God dies and we become the highest form of intelligence and spirit. This is in the mainstream modern mind, in its sense that the human being is at the top of is the most the highest level of purposeful conscious intelligence in the known universe. And this is something that would just seem delusional to many other cultures who recognize that we're special, but we're participants in something much bigger, and that there's other players in this larger field, and that have their own moral value, that have their own that we need to respect and love, rather than regard as simply being objects of our potential exploitation, so that old growth forests just become lumber, and animals just become harvestable commodities, and or lab experiments, or even children's minds become marketing targets, and indigenous cultures they're primitive, and they need to be gotten out of the way so that we can exploit the resources that they're holding back, etc. All that kind of arrogant objectification of the natural world comes from a worldview in which synchronicities aren't possible, because that world is seen as being intrinsically without capacity for carrying meaning and communicating meaning, and only human beings have that. And if you think that you're seeing a synchronicity, you're projecting your subjective meaning onto the world, and that's just delusional. And if you do it a lot, then you probably should get medicated, which is how a number of psychiatrists would react to somebody who sees a lot of synchronicities.
It's an uphill battle with mental health. Take out the pill really quickly when somebody starts talking about this stuff. That's very true. So what there is appearing to me something unique about human beings. It's not as unique as humans think, but that ability to be aware of oneself Now, my son's dog, Walter, is aware of himself. You can just tell that he knows what he's up to, and he's watching what his own mind does. So we know that other species have some capacity for self-reflection within a limited range, but we have a specialness, at least the way I think about it. We have a specialness that has to do with this ability to recognize the things that you're saying. We know that we're here and something else is out there. And now your message is very much, and to me, very important, that they're messaging back to me. I know somebody who's a horse whisperer, and she calls it something different. And she's got a horse that tells her, why are you humans doing this to the planet and to us? And the horse is communicating a real concern, a very real concern for other animals as well as horses. So there is a consciousness in other beings. Maybe it's just that we can talk, but there's still something a little different about the self-awareness of humans. Or
Yeah.
You agree with that? So,
oh yeah, we have a capacity for reflexivity, for a level of radical reflexivity that, to our knowledge, is unique, and that gives us a capacity as well as a responsibility and a burden. The burden could be that there can be that sense of isolation or alienation that comes from being self-aware and feeling that one's not no longer in a kind of unconscious participation in the whole. But I love the idea, your point about, I've heard and read many cases of things like that, where the horse communicates, or it can be, people get it in dreams, where like an animal will appear in a dream, or people will have an experience on ayahuasca or LSD therapy or something like that, where they may become a tree, and they experience that their limbs becoming tree limbs, and feeling rooted, and get insights into what it's like with the whole process of taking in from the sun the energy and the photosynthesis, and then the water and everything coming in, and this almost sense of service that the tree and other plants have in giving to the whole. So the fact that more people are coming into an awareness of this communion of subjects is important. But human beings, now this question of human beings' specialness, I'd like to address that.
please do.
Because I want to distinguish between two kinds of specialness. One is the kind of specialness that is very characteristic of a kind of atheistic, secular, modern humanist, who's very anthropocentric, and who basically says human beings are the only game in town that really counts, that has conscious intelligence, is carrying the possibility of understanding and communicating meaning, and so forth. Maybe some of the so-called higher mammals, like whales or dogs, and then also some birds show fairly sophisticated consciousness, but not at the level of human beings. And in fact, human beings, we talk about, they have sacred rights of the individual, sacred rights of the human person, and all the focus is on the human, rather than recognizing the sacrality of all of nature. So there's that kind of specialness that is characteristic of the mainstream modern disenchanted mind. But then I think as a whole, we're going through a kind of near-death experience as a civilization and a planet, and precipitated by this this kind of arrogance and human exploitation in a one-sided way of the rest of the biosphere, which reflects a lot of processes that went, historically, that brought about this technological capacity, but also this impulse to just objectify the rest of the world, and only we subjects count in our specialness. And so there's a kind of ego death that I think is happening to humanity, that in a way the postmodern period represents a kind of descent into an underworld of transformation. We're going through a kind of initiatory transformation whereby we will, I think, die to the old sense of being special in this arrogant, superior, hierarchical way, and instead we are we die to that old identity and that old view of reality, and we are born into a new reality, which is a very old reality, ancient and venerated, that we are special, but in a new way, because that specialness is rooted in the cosmos and in nature, that is individuating through each of us and through each species. So when Jung uses the term individuation, that's what our life of psychological development is all about, he's not just talking about separating from the crowd. He is including that we each have to find our own individual path. But he's making another point, and that is that it's not just a matter of separating from the whole, either as us as individuals or human beings separating from the rest of nature. It's also, in a fuller journey, coming into consciousness of our relationship to the whole and to the archetypal grounds of experience, and into the soulful depths of nature out of which all of us emerged. And with that recognition and that rebirth, we suddenly discover our specialness, but in a new way, because that specialness, it's like we're now rooted in the earth rather than in a potted plant that's isolated from everything else. We're a good synonym for individuation, as Jung is using it, is flowering. Essentially, in other words, the vision that I'm trying to portray is the idea that the cosmos is essentially creative. As Whitehead would say, it's creative through and through. So it's as Brian Swim calls it, it's a cosmogenetic process. It's cosmogenesis is what's going on all the time. But cosmogenesis likes to, as part of it, it differentiates into all these different species, these different forms of life, the splendor of the variety of life, one of which is the amazing human being. How, as Shakespeare would say, like just how like an angel, how noble, how perfect in so many ways, in form and gifted, in grace and language and thought. And then this is from that same speech it was from a speech in Hamlet from the same play that I quoted from before. And then he says, but this is just dust. The human being is also just in the end is just this kind of quintessence of dust, and recognizing also how little we are. Well, my main point here is this beautiful being that the human is, with such a shadow, that beauty, that intelligence, our capacity for imagination, for reflection, that's the universe's beauty and the universe's intelligence coming through us. It's the universe's own imagination and genius that is taking human form. in each of us, and in each of us in unique ways. So we regain that specialness that you were talking about, but now it's a healthy specialness. It's a specialness that recognizes that we are unique expressions of this grand whole, rather than being in a kind of an isolated elite that's superior to everything else.
Yeah, and I was gonna add Jonathan Swift's quote to your Shakespeare's quote of we are a pernicious race of vermin. More than
Yeah.
that's in between the dust that you were talking about, and
Yeah.
there's so much truth to that. I mean, right now,
Oh
there's
gosh. Yeah.
it's so loud, and what I'm listening to as you describe the de-enchantment or disenchantment, and now the enchantment that could come, is a very simple term. I tend to try to use the simple terms of recognizing our own individuality and recognizing our connection to what's around us. And as a psychotherapist, and maybe Yvonne thinks this way too, is like thinking about how synchronicity can help us recognize our individuality and our connection to just one other person, and how that can then web out. I mean, because you're very conscious of this web of reality, and you're describing it so beautifully, and that's how your mind works. But you've got somebody around the house who has to deal with some people individually, and that gives a balancing that I'm very interested in, that part of it that is looking at both and separate and part, and of individual relationships. Because what I am trying to be able to have synchronicity do something with is be able to make this web more visible, because synchronicity highlights the invisible currents that connect and unify us, and we know we're connected with each other and with nature. I've had conversations with trees, so I know there's a consciousness in trees, as you were kind of suggesting, but they communicate with us just like the horse can, or other animals can. If we tune in to their way of thinking, they can connect with us, and they want to connect with us. The bugs want to connect with me. I've had that happen a lot of time. There's this impulse of these beings around us, these subjects around us, of wanting to be part of the whole thing with us, but have us recognize that they and us are part of the same thing. That's what they seem to want us to do. And I think synchronicity can help do that in many different ways. And that's my practical part of it.
Yeah, that's great that you're bringing it to the level of personal relationship, or in the case of psychotherapy, where there's the that very close relationship between the therapist and the patient or the client, and that both are participating in a field of transformation. That if the when synchronicities happen, like having both of you have the same dream image the night before that you're seeing each other, or you just discover all sorts of synchronistic patterns that can suddenly come up in the course of therapy. That's I see that, or thinking of Yvonne's work in this area, as a kind of helpful support that the field is giving, that the larger unfolding of psychological healing that person is going through can be supported by their recognizing that they are part of a transformational crucible or field that is shared with the therapist, and that they live inside a more, they're not as isolated as they thought they were, and there's also like a larger healing intelligence that's at work within the therapeutic process that gives little synchronistic signs to enhance that trust in the process, in the therapeutic process.
You're the global picture guy, and that's what you tend to do. And just so our audience knows, Yvonne Tarnas is Rick's wife, and she's a therapist, and she's did her dissertation on the first episode meetings between client and patient, and finding that there was so much overlap in many instances between the therapist's past and current problems and the patient's past and current problems, or current problems. And that's suggesting how the patient is sometimes a mirror of the therapist's minds, or sometimes with synchronicity, what's out there is a mirror of our minds. And that what Yvonne and synchronicity and therapy tells us, that you don't have to, you're not the only one as the therapist helping somebody change. The whole process is helping you change as well. And as John Beebe, a Jungian therapist in San Francisco, you know him, told me when I was a first-year resident at Stanford, your problems walk into your office. And and I said, well, who is this guy? But
Yeah.
it stuck with me. It became a strong
Yeah.
Jungian, as you know. And it's the same idea in a micro level of what you're talking about. And to be able to embed the details that I deal with, Yvonne deals with, in the greater view that you have is really a wonderful experience for our audience, to be able to see the individual relationship, the individual mind, the individuation, which I didn't realize from Jung is also not just my individuation, but my flowering that connects me with the web that other flowers are part of. And that's a better definition of individuation than I've ever run across. So that's an important important definition for people to get straight.
Yes, I think I think you're exactly right. Interesting coincidence. It was John Beebe who once said that he felt that the word flowering, which I think he had heard or read Jung use once in relationship to individuation, and he held on to that, and he mentioned it to me, and I thought that's a really good word, because that flowering suggests flowers need roots, and roots go into the earth, and they go into, and they draw on the water and the nutrients in the soil, they draw on the sun and the air, and they're part of this larger organic field of the whole. And so that helps connect to Jung's idea that healing takes place through our being able to tap into the archetypal depths of our own psyche that we all share. That the archetypal unconscious is the collective unconscious. But I think what happened as Jung cultivated his understanding and implications of synchronicity in his later years, his understanding of the archetypal unconscious and the collective unconscious started kind of expanding till he realized this is really the world psyche. It's the anima mundi, the soul of the world. That's what we're reconnecting to. It's not just intracranial of the human being or even collective human beings. So when the trees or the birds or the stars are meaningfully communicating something to human beings, that's a sign that these archetypal principles are not just located inside the human cranium. They pervade nature, they pervade the cosmos, and therefore the whole healing process that's happening in the psychotherapeutic relationship, as well as the whole religious quest to come into some contact with a higher spiritual reality or a divine power of some form, that is ultimately now taking place not just internally inside our own private consciousness. It's being supported by the whole cosmos, and in that sense, everything breathes together as well. It's not just human beings isolated, or even the human species that has its own lock on meaningful consciousness. Those archetypal principles and that capacity for symbolic communication is an aspect of reality itself, and we are participants in it. We're not, and we're latecoming, perhaps very precious, special participants in that larger, meaningful field, but we're not the whole game.
The animation of reality, taking the spirit out of what's around us, that you've described so nicely with Western mind, particularly technological mind. What you're doing for me, and hopefully our audience, is helping me see the animation out there in archetypes, or a more subtle, a more symbolic way of saying what the way things can manifest in archetypal terms. So we can see the animation of the trees and the flowers and the horses. And what you're saying too is the animation of the stars, that the stars are also communicating to us. And the terminology we use for that is astrology, which has always been a correlation or a synchronicity, a meaningful connection between what's going on down here and what's happening up here. I like to point to the sun and the moon just to start with. Why do they look like they're the same size when they're 93 million miles apart? That's saying, hey, human beings down there's something more going on around here than you know.
Yeah, and that's why everyone, including the most disenchanted scientists, are absolutely enchanted watching a total solar eclipse, which could only happen, as you say, it could only happen because the sun happens to be 400 times larger than the moon, but it is 400 times farther from the Earth than the moon, so that when they're lined up at that one point, it's a perfect match. And of course, the sun as the ruler of the day, the moon as the ruler of the night, it's this great kind of cosmic symbolization of this reunion of day consciousness and night consciousness, of basically this a reunion of
Yin and yang.
Yin and yang, of the conscious and the unconscious. It's a what Jung would call a symbol of the self with a capital S, which is the sacred marriage.
Male and female. Yeah, it's
Hieros Gamos, sacred marriage.
They're there together, and they like looking at it. People like looking at it, put their glasses on, but the archetypal meaning of that union, for however brief a time. And I love it that the moon blocks out the sun. I mean, there's something about, hey, you got to be quiet for a little while here. I'm taking over.
Yeah, and everything. No matter how disenchanted and kind of literal minded that the person is who's watching it, there's a numinosity to that experience that's unmistakable. And astronomers fly all around the world to be able to watch one of these happen. And yes, it's partly for rationalistic scientific reasons that they can write a paper about, but they're compelled by, I mean, they're kind of, I think of astronomers as being, they're high priests of the cosmos, who have a sense of its sacredness. They can't quite articulate it, but they're completely compelled by it, and that sense of wonder that they have, whether it's looking at the solar eclipse or looking at the vastness and magnificence of this incomprehensibly large and complex universe. There's a sense of wonder that wells up in them, and that's
and it's that sense of it's that sense of wonder to anomaly, because astronomers say, oh, hey, wait a minute, that gravitational field is not what I thought it would be given what we know currently. So dark energy, dark matter came around. I want to bring down to Earth the interest in anomalies that astronomers and astrophysicists have, because it's the same thing. You get
Absolutely.
curious. Yeah, you get curious. Hey, why'd that happen? It's like, and you try to figure it out. And
Yeah.
synchronicity, meaningful coincidences are clues to how reality works. You know that. I know that because we're both interested in figuring out how this thing works. It's really, what is this going on around here, ladies and gentlemen? And synchronicity is a great key to being able to answer that question, as you well know.
You brought up at the beginning, Bernie, when you're introducing me, that that my book Cosmos and Psyche had been the inspiration for this documentary series called Changing of the Gods. And I wanted to mention, I mean, while I didn't make this, it's a 10-part documentary series, but particularly episode 1 is the one that really focuses on my work and or introduces my work, and as well as how this research began with Stan Grof, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, and our work at Esalen Institute in the 1970s began this. And so anybody who wants to watch this, I mean, Cosmos and Psyche is a substantial book, though if you're I mean, a lot of people seem to enjoy reading the whole thing, I'm glad to say, but it is a commitment. But if you want to get just a taste of it from a team of filmmakers that were associated with Pioneers, the kind of ecological social justice movement and new paradigm community, they were the ones that made this film series. And you can watch that first episode for free if you go to their website, which is Changing of the Gods, one word, changingofthegods.com. And you can just watch. It's a 30-minute opening episode, so that you can get kind of a taste of what we're talking about here. I want to emphasize that, like any human cultural product or project, astrology has a shadow side as well as a noble side, and there are problematic forms of ways of using astrological knowledge. There's tendencies towards determinism, fatalism, almost as if it's a kind of mechanistic system that is going to determine, well, whether you're born under a bad sign or something ridiculous like that. That's not the kind of sort of pop sun sign horoscope column astrology that we're talking about. It's what Jung opened up with his interest in astrology in the 20th century, and others have been involved in over particularly this last 50, 60 years, has been there's something at a much more sophisticated level that's going on, and that recognizes the importance of human beings' conscious participation, intelligent participation in these archetypal fields and forces that are symbolized by the movements of the planets, and being able to know that what these big cycles are, and how human history has unfolded in ways that, as well as our individual lives, unfold in ways that are so powerfully illuminated by understanding the correlation between the planetary movements and these archetypal patterns of human experience. That's the focus that we want to bring, and it calls on human responsibility, human agency, our level of consciousness shapes what happens. We participate in a larger unfolding. One last thing I'll say about that. I think of what archetypal astrological insight provides us with is a kind of sense of like the larger chordal structures, like musical chordal harmonic structures of our lives, but then what notes we sing, what melodies we sing to those chords, what dances we dance to that music, that's up to us. That we play a role in how these multivalent archetypes come through, and that's where our moral and psychological level of awareness plays a big role as well.
Oh, that's I'm so glad you emphasized that. Astrology is not fate. Astrology offers choices. You have the ability to decide. There is some element of free will, not all. It's a limited amount of it, and astrology can give us the bounds within which we can go this way or that way, and it's still our choice. And our choice, as you're emphasizing, influences the whole thing, that we are participatory in what happens out there. And synchronicity, it's got to be important. It's got to be important for people to recognize they're not commands. Coincidences aren't commands. They're suggestions. They're possibilities. They're guidelines.
Invitations to a mystery.
That's a nice Sherlock Holmes story. Invitation to a mystery. I think of it as all very much like looking around. So, Rick, we come to the end of our delightful discussion, and thank you very much. You're so scholarly and so clear in what you say. I so much appreciate being able to talk with you again.
That's very kind of you to say, Bernie. And yeah, I hope that what we talked about will be of value to your audience and our audience today. And thanks for inviting me and drawing me out on these ideas, which are the perfect interface between your life work and mine.
Indeed.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.